Tony Blair, you were Prime Minister on the 7th of July 2005. Can you just tell us how you heard about the attack on London, where you were, how the information was transmitted to you?
On the 7th of July, I was in Scotland at the Gleneagles Hotel, where we were having the major international summit, the G8 summit. And this was literally the day after we'd won the Olympic bid for Britain. It was a moment of great euphoria for the country. For me, it was a huge moment of joy and hope for the future. And I remember sitting in a room having a bilateral discussion with the president of China when someone came in and handed me a slip of paper which said there's been an incident in London and you're going to have to come out of the meeting quickly. So I came. But
without saying what kind of incident?
No, without saying what sort of incident it was. And I came out, and then I was told about the first attacks. At the time, it wasn't quite clear exactly what it was. But then within sort of 20, 30 minutes, it became very clear. And then I spoke to Charles Clarke, who was the Home Secretary at the time. And then as the day progressed, it became obvious that this was a severe set of terrorist attacks. And then I decided I had to go back to London, which I then did. So I left the G8 summit. I remember Jack Straw was chairing the summit in my absence, and literally all the main leaders of the world were there at the summit. So I came back down to London. We spent the time there for the rest of the day, trying both to make sure that we were doing everything that was possible in the light of the attacks that had taken place, but also we were preparing ourselves for what might be further attacks. There were other warnings coming in. We had to take some very difficult decisions around what happened with public transport in London, with the buses and the tube, and what should we do, and how seriously should we take these other threats that were coming in. So I spent the rest of the day doing that, and then the next day came back up to the summit, where we then got a huge statement of support. I mean, a massive show of solidarity for the international community in support of Britain and in support of the people of London.
What did you judge to be the right and appropriate response by the government? And how do you think that changed subsequently?
There were three things that occurred to me immediately. The first was to try and bring people together. I mean, this was obviously an Islamist terrorist attack. On the other hand, I knew that the vast majority of Muslims, not just in London, but in the whole of the country, would be appalled and shocked. So one of the first things was actually to make sure that the community, not just in London, but nationally, came together, and that we expressed solidarity across the boundaries of faith and culture about this attack. The second thing was very specifically to try to deal with the huge trauma that the attack had caused in London, most obviously to the victims and the families of the victims. And then the third thing, which was very much in our minds, is that we were getting further warnings of fresh attacks. And then one of the things that happens in these situations is that you get warnings that you can't be sure whether they're reliable or not. And then for the next few weeks, by the way, we were constantly in anxiety as to whether each time a warning came, you wanted to shut down the underground. But then over time, if you're not careful, you're actually, the people who are making giving these warnings, whether they're going to attack or not, they're getting their way because they're paralyzing the city. So
did you think at the time that there might actually be a plan of sustained and concerted attack on London or on the UK more generally?
We thought at the time it was a distinct possibility that these attacks would not be one-off, and then we were getting further warnings of fresh attacks. And so I remember we were having meetings the whole time about whether we would be suffering another attack, whether each time we got a warning, what did we do about that warning? because obviously you've got a duty of care to people. On the other hand, if you carry on shutting down the city every time there's a warning, then you're going to bring it to a stop. So it was, and you're going to cause panic amongst people. So it was an incredibly difficult set of decisions during that time. And I remember we did take one or two of the warnings very seriously and decide to shut the underground or parts of it. But then we came to a point where I decided you couldn't just carry on doing this. And so we took all the steps of precaution that we could without actually, as I say, shutting down the city, because that would have been disastrous.
I think people will wonder how, when you get this information as Prime Minister, how you evaluate the likelihood that this information is actually a forewarning of an attack.
When you get a piece of information that says such and such a group have issued a warning and say there's going to be a further attack, it's incredibly difficult to evaluate it. Because, by the way, if you decide that it's not credible and then an attack occurs, people are going to be extremely angry about it. On the other hand, if every time there is a warning, you shut down the underground, for example, or you cordon off a part of the city, then they also know that every time they give a warning, they can achieve a certain amount of effect without even having an attack. So it's an incredibly difficult situation. I remember one time when we were sitting around the table, and there would be the relevant ministers there, but also obviously the security people, the police, and so on. And there was a particular warning that we thought was probably not credible.
Was this, how long after?
This was maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, but it was still obviously very fresh in people's minds.
Of course.
And the fact is, there was a warning, and I remember, we debated it for a certain amount of time, and then I said to one of the people around the table, what do you think? Do you think it's really credible or not? And they said, well, in the end, I'm afraid it's a matter of judgment, and that's for you to make. So in the end, I decided actually that we should not shut down the tube on that basis. Unfortunately, that turned out to be the right call, but it could have turned out to be the wrong one. But this is the problem when these terrorist attacks, what they do is, and you can see this from what's happened in other countries, is that they can lead to a sense of trauma that is such that the impact is vast on the whole of the country. And this particular set of attacks, I think, was shocking to people for all sorts of reasons, not least because the attackers were British born, and people just couldn't understand how people brought up with all the benefits and the advantages and opportunities that this country affords people, how people could do that.
What do you say to those people now who say that the causes of 7/7 and indeed subsequent terrorist attacks can all be traced back to our involvement in the invasion of Iraq?
I think one of the most important things to do here is to look at this in the bigger context. 9/11 in New York was probably the first really large-scale terrorist attack. And obviously we had certain foreign policy responses to that. The problem is that even those countries that didn't, for example, participate in Iraq at all, like France, are now subject to these attacks. You see them most recently in Tunisia, but you see even countries like Belgium or Norway, who are countries that have no real foreign policy presence, are also subject to this. And I think at a certain point we've got to realize this is a global problem. You see it in Africa, you see it in the Far East, you see it in Central Asia, and of course you see it in the Middle East. And the only way of dealing with it ultimately is for people to come together, whatever their faith background, and say we are united against this terrorism. and to say we're not going to allow anyone to excuse themselves by saying that the slaughter of totally innocent people is somehow a response to any decision by any government. It's the responsibility of those who carry out these acts of terrorism and those who incite them.
Tony Blair, thank you very much indeed.